Hi everyone, welcome back to the Nancy Boys channel. Today we'll be reviewing Lee Cronin's The Mummy, which was released on Friday, I believe nationwide, and is, I guess, like a continuation of this sort of Universal Monsters era that we've been in for maybe the last 6 years. I think it started with The Invisible Man in the late 2010s, and then we had a pretty average Wolfman last year, directed by Lee Cronin, which was a bit of a disappointment. And then this is a bit of a weird one because it's got this weird naming convention. So it's Lee Cronin's The Mummy. I think we all know that Lee Cronin isn't particularly known yet as a prolific horror director. He did Evil Dead Rise about 3 years ago. Very good. And I understand it wasn't his choice. This is a sort of Blumhouse thing to sort of differentiate the movie from other mummy movies. And rightly so, because this film basically has nothing to do with mummies at all. And without giving away too many of my thoughts, this is essentially another pretty bog standard exorcism movie wrapped up, no pun intended, in something else. So let's just run through the plot points and then we can move on to my thoughts and feelings. The young daughter of a journalist disappears into the desert without a trace. 8 years later, the broken family is shocked when she's returned to them. However, what should be a joyful reunion soon turns into a living nightmare as she starts to transform into something truly horrifying. So, if you saw my review of Thrash last week, which again wasn't hugely positive, there's a bit of a trend. I don't know if it's a trend or it's just something I've seen a few times this year of films that on the surface actually have quite a sort of camp sensibility and actually would work in that kind of context. I definitely saw it with Thrash. I saw it, I think, with Primate. And there were just a lot of films coming out that are quite mid, purely because they take themselves really, really seriously, when if they didn't and they just had a bit of fun, then we'd probably enjoy them a lot more, and the sort of tone would be there. And that's sort of where I'm at with Lee Cronin's The Mummy. And I guess if I start off with the positives, and it's sort of where I wanted the film to maybe go longer term, was I thought the first half an hour was pretty good. It was actually quite a grown-up movie for the first 30 minutes. I thought the relationships they built up were quite good. I really liked the setting. It was quite interesting to see a sort of this kind of movie play out in Cairo in a kind of different kind of setting to your typical suburban house. And I'm glad that it didn't kind of go that way. I think that Natalie Grace, who plays Katie, as the sort of post-mummy version of Katie, was really good. Yes, I think the character does end up going into sort of tropey sort of territory in terms of how they act. It's very much like what you see in exorcism movies, so the crackling bones and the contortion. But she's very good, and actually the look of Katie, I mean, that is nightmare fuel, and I think they've done that really, really well. Albeit there's some sort of internal logic about that as well in terms of how the film plays out. But I think when I saw the trailer, there was an element of me thinking that looks quite Blumhouse-like, and it was. My initial views were kind of founded, but I thought her character design, the kind of creature design, was good. In terms of what I thought I didn't like about it, yeah, a number of things, and I think the main issue with me, and I'm afraid to say I'm a pedant, and if you can watch films without needing too much logic, you might be okay with this. I felt that every third scene, there was another moment where it just took me out of the movie because I just thought, I don't understand that. Like, logically, that doesn't make sense. Or a character might act irrationally or do something that doesn't really kind of add up. Or just a line of dialogue which might be really clunkily written. And this film, I think, God, it's a bit like Thrash from last week. Could someone just not have spent maybe an hour or two just refining the script? And I think it's a real shame that you establish this quite nice family dynamic in the first 30 minutes of the movie. And then all the characters, although they live in the same place, sort of exist in their own little worlds. They don't really cross over. And as much as they're in this one house, they don't really seem to kind of talk a lot, or there'll be big commotions happening in other rooms and other characters just don't respond to it. So it starts to feel just quite weird and quite distant. And it also has a problem with time as well and pacing. So there's a kind of subplot of, the characters have moved from Cairo to New Mexico. So they've gone to Albuquerque. And the character in Egypt is sort of talking back and forth with the characters here. And we almost end up in a real lack of time zones. Like, characters travel in a very quick amount of time. Certain characters travel when they are clearly in a state where they shouldn't be. I'm talking about the main character here. Like, she ends up moving from Cairo to New Mexico, and you just think, well, there's no way that would have happened based on what we know in terms of how she's behaving and how erratic she is. So there's just a lot of this weird internal logic, and as I say, every third scene you just thought, that's weird. Like, why would they do that? There's a sequence where they've got the girl back, and I'm not going to give away too much, that the kidnapped girl's returned, and they take her to her bedroom and they put her in bed, but they get her there by pulling her up the stairs in the wheelchair. So one, you're like, why haven't you adapted this house so she could just go up and downstairs? Because this is going to be a problem. But why are they doing it in the wheelchair? Like, pick her up, take her upstairs, and then, take the wheelchair up separately. And there's a lot of things in this film that frankly felt like we're going to put this in for cinematic reasons, not because it's actually going to make any kind of internal logic with the film. And that also kind of is my second biggest issue with this. And I've heard a lot of online chatter about how this is absolutely the most terrifying movie, and it's so disgusting, and it's a spectacle in terms of the violence that plays out. Like, undoubtedly true. Like, there's a lot of gore, there's a lot of sort of carnage candy on display. But again, it sort of just doesn't feel necessary, and it doesn't feel believable. Again, it's like if you leaned into humor, you could go down that Evil Dead route of, oh, okay, like this is fantastical and comic and it's like splatstick. And it doesn't, because it sort of wants you to think that the film is like horrific and scary and credible. And I just found that gore was so overdone. It keeps kind of slapping you around the face throughout the movie. And absolutely, like, I was in a cinema, there were people shrieking and having the time of their lives. It just left me cold. I think I've seen a lot of gore in my time anyway. And it comes a point where it's got to be a bit sparing to have an impact. And it's like we were going for gross out, where actually, again, as I said at the beginning, there was an intelligent movie here. And if they'd gone down that route, kept that violence a bit more sparing, tidied up some of the lore and some of the plot points, you could have had a decent film here. You could have had something that actually would have done something like fairly useful with the IP that I just didn't think they did. And I think, the two parents, unfortunately, are just idiots. And it's a shame, because they're not idiots at first, but they've become idiots. And again, you're not quite sure, like, where am I supposed to think these people are, like, sensible or not? I don't know who I'm supposed to root for. And ultimately, yeah, it just kind of didn't hang together. And, the biggest, I guess, issue, like, horror films should never be boring. And this film is 2 hours and 15 minutes long. It has no business being this long. I love a 90-minute in and out movie, but that said, I love a long movie if it earns it. And in terms of the ending, it really is one of those sort of balls to the wall, let's throw all the effects and all the kind of bombast and CGI at the screen. It reminded me a little bit of the ending of Conjuring Last Rites, actually. We'd had all this sort of subtle build up interspersed by gore. This loud spectacle, swirling chaos, CGI nonsense ending, which I can't stand. It's a real trend of movies of the last 10 to 15 years, if not longer. And it seems to come from, I would say, generally Marvel movies, and it's started to bleed into horror. I mentioned this is a Blumhouse movie, and it just very much is. And it sounds really snobbish, but it's like these films are made for either a certain type of horror fan, or they're not actually made for horror fans at all. They're designed to get people to buy a ticket on a Friday night when there's nothing else on, and it's a horror flick. And it's the loudness and the kind of constant jump scares in this film that just, for me, like, as a bit of an aficionado of horror, and I sound so snobby right now, just make it seem a lot cheaper, because it didn't need it. And like, there's a sequence where they're cleaning this character who frankly should have been cleaned a long time before she's brought into the house, and the film takes a long time to give her like a hair wash, and there's a nail cutting sequence, like all that stuff. Just, again, it doesn't make sense, but it makes sense for the film because we want to establish this character as looking a bit gross. But there's a scene with her where we're kind of looking after her, and there's a hairdryer jump scare, and it's just unnecessary. We have so many of these moments. Again, you can tell, right? You can tell the jump scare's coming by the lack of soundtrack and that silence, and it's been done so much to death that I'm starting to get a bit unforgiving with it in 2026. Like, I feel like we're better than that. And I think Lee Cronin actually is a better filmmaker, whether that was studio interference or Jason Blum putting a bit of a sort of Blumhouse influence on it. But that stuff needs to stop. It's cheap. We are cleverer as viewers than needing those kinds of jump scares. Like, earn them, make them fewer and far between, and make them scarier. You won't need all that fluff in between. And again, I was in the cinema with people who were jumping at just absolute nonsense happening on the screen.
Loud noises!
Obviously, there's a place for that, and I'm only a snob because I watch a lot of horror movies, and that's my view. And of course, people can go into this and enjoy it in that sort of popcorn way, but not one for me, guys. I thought this was very weak. I thought it was going to be weak based on the trailer. I heard a lot of buzz in the week about it being something different, and ultimately, I found it quite disappointing. So yeah, it's a 2 Nazis out of 5 for me. We'll see what Lee Cronin does next. It very much felt like Evil Dead Cairo to me. And I think the guy's got something. He did Evil Dead Rise, so let's see if he can break free of the studio system and then come back with something new, because he's not established yet. So check it out if you want. I would not say go to the cinema and see it. It's not recommended. But let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you on the next one.